Uh, uh, Welcome everyone who join us both online and also offline. Uh, we, the Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Indonesia, very happy to welcome you all for this uh, Research Day, 8th series of Research Day this year. So we have this research presentation monthly. So because this is August, so this is the 8th presentation of this year. We are thank you, Tiffany, for coming and to be with us to share your work with us. And I think yeah, we are lucky that we are going to listen to your story, what you have been doing, what you are still working on with this project. And yeah, I think everyone who joined offline or online are so you know um, looking forward to listening to your presentation about your project, the story about this project. And yeah, I think without further ado, I'd like to pass on this microphone to you. Oh, wait a second. I forgot to introduce you. Sorry, because I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I need to open up my phone. So everyone, our speaker today is Dr. Tiffany Jimenez. She is a community psychologist. She is rooted in indigenous Americas, Mexico, traversed through terrains of Turtle Island, known as California. So are you, I mean, from California then? But right now, Tiffany is teaching at the National Louis University in Chicago. And yeah, Tiffany is an associate professor at the National Louis University in Chicago. Tiffany is the recipient of the 2019 NLU, National Louis University Excellence in Research, Scholarship, and Inquiry Award. And Tiffany graduated from the Michigan State University. She got her doctorate in community psychology from the Michigan State University. I think that's a little bit about yourself. Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, yes. So please, the mic is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is this correct? I just want to make sure it's loud enough. Okay, hi. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here in person with you after everything that's happened over the years. Just so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about this work that we've been doing over a number of years. So, and it's so important that we do it in multiple locations for various reasons that I think you'll understand when you learn a little more. So I'm going to get familiar with the technology here. So yeah, the title of this is the Glocal Village Project on Embodying Decoloniality. I will give you a little overview. First, give you a bit of my own positionality and locale within the world, how that shapes the project. Describe history and context of the Glocal Village Project, introduce the main decolonial concepts that we've utilized in the work, unpack the project as a research project. This will be the first time I've actually done this. So you will unpack it as science and methodology. We will present the results in terms of concepts and theories that have emerged from the work and discuss conclusions and next steps. So this is quite a lot to take in, I realize that, but I just want to show this to kind of indicate sort of where I'm coming from, geographically and psychologically, I guess. So my name, full name, is Tiffany Raylene Trias Tafoya Jimenez. And that is in recognition of the ancestors that came before me. I want to draw attention to this map here. This is my ethnicity estimate from DNA estimate. And so it demonstrates sort of my mixed mestiza heritage, being from Indigenous Americas, Mexico and North America, and also having mixed identities in other locations historically. And this is my mother and father. My dad is from this lineage and my mother is from this lineage. And I think this is relevant when we think about sort of identity and our subjectivities and the histories that have shaped who we are and our psychology. And so I think all of this will become more relevant as you learn more. But this is sort of where I grew up. And this is in the suburbs of California. This is up in the mountains of California. And I think this is significant in the sense that I grew up living in two very different worlds. And this sort of Nepantla or borderlands living has really honed a perspective on the world that I think has shaped a lot of what questions I ask, the research questions that I ask. These are some of my ancestors and my grandmother and some of my cousins and uncles. And this is my mom's side from other areas of the world that I know actually less about, but are grounded in Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and Scotland, and England as well. Sure how to like stuck. So while we're figuring this out, I'll say a few more things. Just that since I was a kid, I've been questioning from a heart space, sort of what is it that is causing all the suffering in the world. So, oh, that's right. Yeah, I could do that too. That's right. We'll do that. We'll do that. Okay. So I'm driven by, since I was a kid, always questioning why the world works the way it does. And I never indicated that I would ever end up in academia at any point, but here I am working at Chicago. I'm in a university. It's called National Louis. It's located right by the Lake Michigan, if you're familiar with the United States. And it's Midwest of the United States. And this is some of our students and faculty, some of our students as well here. But what I wanted to show you through this is how diverse our student body is. We serve a high number of Black and Latinx students. And so the orientation of our university is very social justice oriented, and its positionality as an institution really forces us to be asking questions that serve the interests and needs of our students specifically. So I think, again, this context, educational context, is sort of important for understanding how this project came to be within this particular institutional context. So, a little bit about the Glocal Village project on decoloniality. So there's an organization by the name of Psychologists for Social Responsibility, and they've addressed a number of issues from psychology being used in Guantanamo Bay in the torture of prisoners, to the issue of racial justice and use of the term of decoloniality and some of that work. In CISR, I think it's important to note this organization is not American Psychological Association associated. It is a separate organization of psychologists that have come together to address the injustices outside of dominant institutions like APA. So there's a positionality there in this network of people that I think have really allowed us to question things in a different kind of way. And I think in the beginning, we were interested from a racial justice angle. We had at National Louis hosted a number of conferences called Racial Justice in Praxis. And, we were really trying to understand how our dominant social and institutional systems are manifesting racism in multiple ways, institutional racism. And we went from thinking about this as having a seat at the table to people of color being centered in conferences and really driving this connection to the concept of the village. So we really wanted to understand racial justice in a larger global context, and particularly really connecting to this concepts of global north and global south, but also particularly the experiences of people of color located in the global north with diasporas from the global south. Not to go into that into too much detail, but this led to the project called the Pilgrimage to the Village, which was US context oriented, but has gained global momentum in many ways, and that will become clear. It started as a community writing project where we view racial justice through the lens of decoloniality and coloniality, which are some concepts I'll go through. But the village that started this project really were 8 National Louis students and alumni and faculty and a host outside of the institution. And then we engaged what we would call a healing praxis of reclaiming the village. So in my attempts to reframe this as a research study, I guess our starting research question was, how have our lives been impacted by coloniality? And what is coloniality? And this was a 5-year project. It started from the racial justice and praxis conferences where we had ongoing dialogues, to papers, to the idea of chapters in a book, to this, what we'll talk about later, the special issue. We wanted to radicalize approaches to psychology and embody decoloniality. There were multimodalities utilized and in our attempt to communicate our messages. We wanted to uncover how coloniality makes us feel and how we're working to de-link from these systems around us. So I give you this image because I'm hoping you will kind of lock it in your mind as I read something next. But I want you to be thinking about how we are tied to a number of institutional practices that may need to be questioned, and just keep that in mind. So I'm just going to read this a bit because I think it kind of captures this idea in some depth. There is a colonial voice inside each of us that is sometimes hard to acknowledge. It is intertwined in so many aspects of ourselves and the ways and institutions of the world. Layers of dominant narratives, a structural fabric that is a way of being and knowing, inseparable from structures of oppression. These systems of beliefs are so ingrained that we integrate them into our own ways of being without realizing it. We have become independent agents of the forces of coloniality without the need to be instructed to do so. We carry memory and voices, sometimes silenced, of different ways of being, doing, and knowing. As we continue to engage in resistance and re-existence, connecting to non-colonial roots, we raise our consciousness to a decolonial mindset and a psicología de la gente, a psychology of the people that opens radically new options. So to give a little bit of some basic concepts that were utilized in the project, I want to just outline a few that are related to this concept of the Colonial Matrix of Power. And the concept of this was really coined by Quijano in 2002, but was picked up further in more recent publications by McNullo and Walsh, which have been really pivotal in my understanding of these concepts. But I encourage you to read and watch videos and every other possible thing you can get your hands on if you're curious about these concepts. So coloniality, modernity, and decoloniality are 3 interlocking concepts that really work together to help us understand this matrix and our positionality within the matrix. And modernity is probably the hardest concept to really understand because it's the water that we swim in, but it's the underlying ideologies that shape our current reality. And this is different all over the world, but in some ways it is sort of similar. And this is what the point is. It's our dominant reality. It's this linear, it's unidirectional, it's about progress. It's about this new model of global power in the sense of it's embedded in a way of being that's tied to neoliberal capitalism and global capitalism. And the United States is in particular a huge power player in this dominant reality. So the flip side of this living in modernity is the dark side of modernity, which I would call a critical concept here, this coloniality. It's the enactment of dominant Western ideological assumptions within everyday life that perpetuate systems of power, but it's acknowledging who is suffering in order for that shiny world to exist, all of that progress and hopes for the future, things like that. The third concept that's tied in here, and really is an analytical concept, is this decoloniality, which helps us to uncover the etiology of dominant ideologies. It helps us to investigate their power over us, to grapple with the harm inherent in these systems, and help us to see these worldviews and how they're manifesting in local, national, and global environments. And these are all very heady terms, and I know this. And this project is really an attempt to try to bring some life into them. So interestingly, I had an opportunity to present this same project in Chiapas, Mexico, just this February. And I presented at this conference called Autonomies in Practice: Economies, Identities, Arts, Land, and Territories that Heal. And as you can see, the emphasis was really grounded in practice. It's grounded in the people that are doing social change work in local communities all over the world. There were people there from everywhere. And these were just some images from this conference. The Global Tapestries of Alternatives, a group of indigenous communities that come together to really work with regenerative communities. There were lots of books there. This is Decolonizar la Enfermedad, and this indicates decolonizing disease. And there were some sessions that were about mapping. In this case, it was mapping the land and the stories of the land and learning more about how the land functions. And this was about mapping our experiences in the resistance. And back here, there was a mapping of the body, which we'll learn a little bit more about later. But I had a session with someone here, and they're kind of cut off, and we talked about this project. And what was interesting to me is because I just so respect the work that these people are doing, and I expected them to be like, oh, we don't need this stuff that you're doing, right? Because being in Chicago and the United States, it's like this very cognitive oriented way of living where you're not really embodied. And actually, to be fully embodied in the United States is a really tough thing to do, because you kind of have to be dissociated in order to be in the United States. So what was interesting is that they agreed that the project that we were describing fit what they needed as well. So in this location of the world, they felt that the history of colonization that happened among the Spaniards and the Catholic and Christian church in that region actually needed to be investigated. And they were really talking a lot at this conference about violence against women and trying to understand how to address that issue from a larger cultural systemic level. And this woman that I met there was working with her son on this project, but they thought, we need this here. We need to unpack how we are enacting coloniality, or we're experiencing coloniality and enacting modernity in different ways here in Mexico. So surprisingly, it applied there as well. So just to unpack an analytical concept of decoloniality a little bit more, I think something to know about this term is that when you go through this process, ideally, it involves an epistemic turn where you emerge as a questioner, a thinker, a theorist, a writer, or a communicator, whatever modes work for your communication style, really. But you're really moving outside of the coloniality that you've experienced, and so that is the key. It's this learning to choose to move outside of that. So it's aesthetic, philosophically, it's aesthetic, it's somatic, it's a spiritual turn. Some use the term this senti pensar, this sensing and questioning are a key aspect of this work. Questioning necessitates an open body that refuses to wear masks and be closed to others. And I think you'll see that in some of the work. But keeping the body open as a continued source of questioning, and this is what I would call embodied epistemology, is an important source of this. But it is definitely a collective project, and I think you'll get that sense. Okay, so I call this a retrospective on our decolonial science because we didn't really think about it as research, right? And we are looking back on it now, trying to describe it as such. And so this is our first attempt. But first, I do want to ground us in what is the philosophy of science. So if we're going to describe a whole new a new philosophy of science that is not grounded in a colonial matrix of power, then we need to understand what we are and are not a part of. And so this may look similar to some of you who have studied research methods books. It's often accompanied by a table that follows this with what you'll see on the next slide. But this, I think I'll just give you the general gist of it, that this continuum is a philosophy of action science. And on this end is where you would get more of the positivist research, where it's like basic science discovery, laboratory trials, like clinical trials. And that is more enacted by medical model perspectives like translational science, right? Before you bring something to communities, you want to test it. And so that is this realm. And then there's the post-positivists that work to disseminate or implement ideas that are tested in more clinical settings. The constructivists are acknowledging unique realities and uncovering systems of power and oppression and constructing new concepts for us to understand the world in different ways. And then there's the transformative, which is really acknowledging that injustices exist and that we need to identify critical data analysis for change purposes. The furthest here is the ecological, which acknowledges that humans are enmeshed with the universe and actively attend to Earth's ecosystems. You might consider any group that's seeking to connect with regenerative Earth systems, indigenous communities, and different worldviews that might fit within an ecological frame. So I'm going to ignore the rest of this for now, because I really want to just point out the fact that the project we're talking about falls somewhere between these two, and I think actually encapsulates both of them. So for each of those on the continuum, there's really an unpacking of the science that's embedded. So within each of those, you have to clarify the ontology, the epistemology, and the methodology. And so the ontology are the assumptions that we make about the nature of reality. The epistemology is how we acquire that knowledge. And then the methodology are the techniques for collecting and analyzing the data. So I'll be unpacking that within our project. What's interesting about this project is that it's all about process. It's happened over a number of years, 5 years. And so when we look at Gloria Anzaldua's comment here, the purpose is not just to tell, but to show how decoloniality happens. So when the research is about the process, how do we talk about the philosophy of science? I think this is a completely new way of thinking about science. And so to articulate this more decolonial onto epistemology, it really is a decolonial process of investigation, liberatory praxis, and some might call. But I think right here are the assumptions of the nature of reality and how we're acquiring the knowledge in this particular project. And so I want to give you each one here. So first, sacred space is a precondition of the work. You cannot do this within existing dominant settings. It has to be a created space. And it's based on relationality, which is here. But second, questions asked have power. The assumption that the questions and inquiry that we come to is a power source. And so our choice of what data deserves attention is ours, and that is our enactment of power. Embodiment, or the embodied epistemologies, is the idea that experiences of the body are important data. Those aren't things to be ignored in our experience within the research. Relationality is this collective intention where all bodies matter and all are connected, which is how it connects with that more ecological end of the philosophy of science. And then the last point here is that processes uncover ongoing relevant data and the nature of ongoing questions, inquiry, and action. And that this is all tied to processes of shifting actions over time, which is where it ties back to the embodiment. But I do think, the source of the data that's relevant continues to emerge over time through this. And some might call that emergent strategy or emergent processes. So that is the sort of underlying philosophy of the project. And then this is the mix of the methods that we've used over time. And there are 4 total. I've got 2 on this slide and 2 on the next slide. So first, that was the first like point in the philosophy is the holding of sacred space, which is this grounding in relationality and long-term relationship building. It's this assumption that I will always care about your being in the world and what happens to you. It was, in this case, facilitated by a person from Asian transnational diaspora with a Chinese background. And the villagers, if we want to call them the villagers, I'm going to call them the villagers, our participants were the villagers, who were primarily Black and Chicanx and were openly volunteers. We were all openly engaged in this very open project and presented a number of times on the work we were doing all throughout the process. So it was not something where you needed IRB or like institutional review approval or anything like that, or consent forms. No. This is all very public. So the second method was this self-narrative inquiry or investigation, I like to call it, where the researcher is an equal participant in the process, which was myself and everybody else. But the choice of narrative emphasis and questions asked over time is really the primary role of the self in the project. And this included the remembering of our ancestral stories. So this is the narrative aspect. The third piece is the application of the critical concept through our narrative process of the reflexivity. And so you might, from a qualitative method standpoint, utilize the terms inductive and deductive analysis here. It was a mixture of the two, but its use of coloniality concept was used to uncover the effects of colonialism, the symptoms of living within the colonial matrix of power. And then number 4, we come to this sort of collective action scholarship where we're doing oral and written analysis processes. So this is a connected listening, really the resonances that we had in our conversations together was part of the process. They make the data more meaningful to the storyteller, being seen by others, but also hearing that other people are resonating with those experiences was part of the validation that was part of the healing process that we would argue. Connecting concepts across villagers was another part of this process. So we wanted to see the common roots of symptoms living in the colonial matrix of power. And so this constant reconnecting to the CMP, which we call the CMP Octo, and I'll tell you about that in a second. Yeah, it's all part of that. And then continuous collective critical reflexivity using coloniality. So we were rewriting our narratives. We were working to re-exist in reality through these narratives and the retelling of these stories. So I call these results because we've never thought about it that way. But I'm presenting this as a very research presentation. It's so odd, actually. Okay, so our first question, remember the first originating research question was, what is coloniality? How do I feel, or how do I experience coloniality? What does it feel like? And so the what it feels like from the collective action theory of embodied coloniality is that it really was part of this octopus. Okay, so a lot of people aren't thinking about the octopus as a theory, but it really is in a sense. And so I'm going to back up just to go back to the slide, but I wanted to show you that image because we collectively had been telling our stories and resonating with what was feeling right in this alternative space. And then someone said, it's like you're being caught in an octopus. It's like you could feel the tentacles and the suckers. It's like the minute you got away from one of them, another one would grab you right away. There was no getting out of the colonial matrix of power. And so the importance of this embodied concept really, it was grounded in our feelings about how the CMP works in the world, in our world. And so some of the feelings associated with being trapped in the CMP were feeling inadequate, feeling self-hatred, feeling that life is a performance, feeling in constant competition and at war with each other, questioning ourselves and our choices, feeling maybe even a sense of imposter syndrome in different settings. And so I think this image is really sort of helpful. This was not an image we created ourselves. It was one that we found online. And so we thought, wow, this is actually a concept that people are taking in many directions. But if you look closely in here, and this is part of our special issue, the place, location, and local development is one arm. This is the prison system. This is state violence. This is finance and investments and research and energy and defense. And you can see how all of this is tied to a larger consciousness. And if you look real close, you can see these white men in here. I know you can't see them where you're at, but that's what's in the eyes here. So there is this dominant consciousness that we are all grappling with. Interestingly, we found this online. So an organization in Canada, North America, is also experiencing the octopus. You can see the octopus here. So this made us feel connected to a larger global community in a sense. They were also working with an alternative setting and really how to navigate some of the effects of the octopus. So to continue to understand sort of what coloniality feels like, another aspect of this was this feeling of like, some people had referred to things as like feeling mini earthquakes, this sort of breaking down inside. So we refer to these as like fault lines, like earthquake fault lines, or fractured bodies. And so feeling like maybe you're lacking purpose and meaning in life, not knowing who we are and our connections with others and the earth, this lack of connection in general, unable to understand our own true power aside from the ideas of power or false concepts of power provided by the colonial system. They give you things like money and positions and guns, maybe gives you this sense of power, but really, you know, what is the power that comes from within? Another point here about what it feels like, required to solve our own issues using tools and strategies that are discontiguous to our ways of knowing. So not consistent with who we are or how we view ourselves. So we have to depend on money. Maybe we turn to isolated therapy, individual clinical therapy settings, for example. Yeah, so these were some of the feelings. And I like to bring this in here because Gloria Anzaldúa was, I would say, is arguably one of an earlier decolonial thinker who utilized myth from her ancestral histories to try to unpack herself, her feeling of disembodiment. And she used this Koya Shauki as part of her learning to re-exist in the world. And some of the questions she asked herself through this was, where did it begin? The pain, the images that haunt me. And that's connected to sort of my own story. And so I want to unpack, just because I can't tell the stories of others individually, but I can tell my own. It's part of this project. And so my own self-narrative inquiry was grounded in the focus of how coloniality impacted me through educational settings. And in the beginning, I had to ask myself, well, what is epistemic colonization? What does that mean exactly? So this is really the definition of it. And I'm just going to read it quickly. The cultural injustice that occurs when the concepts and categories by which people understand themselves and their world are replaced or adversely affected by the concepts and categories of the colonizer. And I think I had to unpack that in, well, then what does that mean in my life and my story, my narrative? So there's this, I was engaged in a process of reflexivity through outward processing, which is basically talking to others. I realized I'm an oral processor, like I learn through talking and sharing with others and through my own writing. But I'm also a visual learner. So I had to draw myself. And I was also trained through education to be more of an objective researcher, right? So to be able to understand myself more, I had to see myself more as an object. And so I asked the similar questions that Gloria Anzaldúa asked herself is, where does it hurt? The pain, the images that haunt me. And I'm not going to read all of this. I just want to give you a couple, but these are the questions that are embedded in the drawing that I did early in this process. Why do you denounce your color, hair, and feeling of connection to the earth? Why do you feel you must try so hard to hide your feelings? Why was being more masculine more valuable? Being stoic, logical, trying to gain power and control, not being dependent on others? Why is it so hard to learn the language of your village? What's stopping you? Why do you say your name like that? How does it feel when people feel shocked? Why do you not see your gifts? Why are all the gifts outside of yourself? So these are just some of the questions I was asking. Some of the pains I think I had felt my entire life and I had never really been able to kind of address and still working on. And I think, you know, in thinking about the project and sort of this self-navigation that we each went through, we chose different images, authors, videos, sources of information that resonated with ourselves and helped us to unpack answers to many of our questions in this retelling the stories of our own lives. And this image is one that resonated very deeply with me, and that I had always kind of been working on, like, how to fix the world, like how do I change this world to make it a better place, and then I, you know, was always disconnected from my own body and my own feelings. So wanting to be more reconnected. So another piece of this is this embodying decoloniality is really emerging as an activist. It's emerging as a self-activist. It's really learning to discern the world around us in a way that makes us really have an ability to negotiate our subjectivity within reality. And so what that really means is I understand my choices in much more depth. I understand that I have the power to choose and the effects embedded in that choice. And so this is just to kind of tell you, sort of, after all this internal investigation, what am I doing now, right? So I've emerged as more of an activist in many ways, I'd say, even though I was always in some ways that. But you know, I'm a community psych PhD faculty at National Louis, where I am engaged in creating as many liberating educational experiences as I can create. I've created 2 new courses recently on embodying decoloniality and cross-cultural communication, and then also one on leadership philosophy. I'm also part of this Chicanx Council of 13, where we are working together to build more community and our own healing practices from a decolonial standpoint. And working more with this, which I work with Dickie in this group, this critical global education group, where we are supporting institutional change across the field of community psychology and reimagining community psych education within a global historical context. I'm also working as an evaluator for National Louis, developing our institution as a Hispanic serving institution, which is collaborating with Chicanx and other communities for co-curricular development. And so it's really questioning, what is pedagogy, what is education, what is andragogy, and how do we kind of discern what kind of information is best presented within an educational setting for different types of communities that we want to experience some level of power in the world. I'm also engaged in creating a new philosophy of scholarship with our provost office at the university, and really focusing more on communicative justice, sociolinguistic justice, and the use of multimodal scholarship. So in the end, we have a special issue with a number of these stories. And I just want to point out that we've got these 4 other stories, part of the Village group, who are all located in Chicago. Duadne had this concept of Sankofa, which is to go back and retrieve the generational resources from your history, and the importance of that and the fulfillment of that. The second was Deidre Somerville, who talks about the Black mother line, but also particularly the connection back to Mother Earth. The third is Jackie Samuel. She refers to what she calls the dark matter. And this is referring to the sense of metaphysical catastrophe that are experienced by the Black community all around the world, and how we can resituate and reconfigure our thinking about that. Jerry Palmer talks about the code of silence, intergenerationally, how her mother actually was trying to stick to a code of silence about her experiences in the world, but how Jerry has now flipped that to be more vocal than ever about everything. And then Gloria West talks about the kind of navigating the redlining of Chicago mostly, but talking about her emerging as a self-activist and this concept of the mobile village. Somebody that lives without access to their own sense of land and place. Then when we think about this connection to the glocal, and you know, I never unpacked that actually. When I say glocal, what I'm referring to is we're grounded in a local space, but we are constantly referring to what's happening somewhere else in the globe. It's like always remembering that the actions that I take right here, right now in my location are affecting somewhere else, somewhere in the world. So that's the concept of the Glocal Village. So when we connect it to this, we also in the special issue have Palestinian resistance stories. And Hana Massoud has a number of articles in the issue that really is trying to connect us to this part of the world under the most extreme conditions and torture being experienced by settler colonialism now. And then we have Oksana, who talks about the decolonizing the science of psychology and how as an immigrant to the United States from the Soviet Union and with a family background in the Ukraine, talking about the perspective of scientific racism and how the history of psychology is deeply embedded in racist ideologies. So I bring this up under the point that decolonial theory comes from our own fractured bodies in this project. And so body mapping is the tool I used in unpacking my own fractured body. But it is a tool that's used in many health settings. I mean, right? Like if you go to the doctor, they ask you, where do you feel your pain? How severe is it? Rated on a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever, right? And so that's a pretty common tool for understanding pain, but it's not necessarily utilized when we're talking about psychological pain or emotional pain or deeply intergenerational pain. And so that's much harder to understand. But as you saw from my example, it's the narratives about who I am that have shaped the pains that I'm experiencing in my example. So I want to encourage you to join us in the Glocal Village in your own place in the world and consider these questions. How does coloniality make you feel? How has it influenced your ways of being in your body? So more recently, and I love this concept of compost activism for several reasons, but we're starting to embrace it a bit more. The concept really came from a person by the name of Bayo Komalafe, and you could read more. He has an article on this in 2016 online. But really, the idea is we're utilizing concepts that are grounded in life systems. You know, it could be easy for me to create concepts, philosophical concepts that are real abstract and really interesting. But really, our goal is to connect back to the earth and to understand a living psychology and how we're all part of this living system. And really that death and rebirth and reexistence and life is all a process that we are connected to, that we are part of this process of composting in the world. And so we like the concept because it's really helping us to understand these processes here. So it's a healing praxis of reclaiming the village, acknowledging our bodies feeling emptiness, acknowledging the loss of knowledges that were never been able to be passed down intergenerationally, a collective grieving about this knowing, this processing, digesting, like earthworms, like bugs in a bin that are composting the trash and the darkness, reclaiming cognitive territories and re-existing via story, really bringing back up old language that may have been lost, remembering, attaching and integrating. And actually, when I was in Chiapas, Mexico, this concept of remembering, the woman in my session really wanted to study what it meant to actually remember and to really is like reattaching to your body. To remember your ancestry, to remember a language, to remember those stories really adds to who you are. And she thought that this process of remembering would actually change your physiological structure. But really, in the end, it's about creating new bodies and soil for reconnecting and creating. So some basic conclusions here, because I don't know how much time it's been, but coloniality manifests differently in different parts of the world and for different people. So based on different histories and different cultures and different backgrounds, you may have different ways that this would relate. Decolonial concepts can help us de-link from harmful human-made systems. So if we understand the history of colonization and the sort of the ideology of why colonization was even happening, like what are we reacting to in the world? Everyone is reacting to something that came before it in this place of survival potentially. So, you know, how can we de-link from some of those harmful reactions in different ways? Collective actions or embodied praxis can be a community-driven approach to healing the symptoms of living within global capitalism. I think this is super important because we're educating and developing professional psychologists in the world, like what are we actually training them to do? And if we know that community-driven approaches are effective and can actually help us to connect more to regenerative system development in the world beyond us individually, then what are we doing? We desire to continue to map our Glocal Village and reconnect with the world in new ways that support regenerative natural ecologies, right? So that is the whole idea here. It's like, how do we connect with everyone around the world that wants to be in that way of being? And then actually we failed. As much as we enjoyed this, we failed at the original project because this was a book project. It started as a book project. The journey to the village was supposed to be a chapter in a larger book of a lot of other communities that were grappling with similar questions. And the book project never happened. But we see it as a sign of success, actually, because it was interesting because the more we tried to sell our ideas to publishers and to different people who didn't understand what we were trying to do, we kept having to make these choices of, do we compromise what we're doing or do we stick to what we're doing? And so ultimately, we never got a book project. But we ended up getting a special issue in the Global Journal of Community Psych Practice. So I encourage you to go find this and read it and watch it. And it's got YouTube's stories, there's theory development, but poetry, images, podcasts. I mean, there's many things embedded in this multimodal project. And if you look for it, it's called Coloniality Unplugged, Cosmologies and Terrains of the Dark Matter. And then we are the editors of this project. Gordon Lee was the facilitator of the project who held the space. Hannah was the Palestinian. Erica Mingo was also part of holding the space for this project. And then, you know, just to kind of show some of the images, but I want to draw your attention to, oh, this was the drawing of the Octo in our moment when we were like, oh my gosh, the octopus is everything, you know? And so that's actually evidence that that's what happened. But, you know, there's other images here too, right? So like how England has colonized the world and how that relates to thinking about this glocal idea. But I want to draw your attention to this concept of the rhizome, which is a connected, and it's by Deleuze and Guattari. It was concept created in 1987. But what I love about this is that rhizome is this idea of a chaotic root system that kind of grows in the dark, that creates pathways in ways that you might not expect. And it really creates these offshoots of creative life systems. And so we think about ourselves as part of a rhizome, and we're looking to connect more with other people who are enacting this sort of growth, a regenerative growth system. And this is different from, say, something of like a hierarchy or a root branch system that grows in one direction, because rhizomes grow in many directions and are medicinal, actually. Ginger is one example. So yeah, so this is the project. But I also want to end with this, because in thinking about the global connection, I think, you know, one of the classes I taught that Dickie was actually a part of in that class, it was a cross-cultural class. And so we had been connecting with people all over the world who are wanting to tell their stories and uncover themselves as part of this network, this rhizome. And so I think this is continuing to grow. But yeah, that's it. I don't know what's better to keep up. We'll keep it here.
Thank you, Tiffany, for the presentation. I think I found a key phrase in your presentation that really represent your presentation today. I think in one of the slides, there was this line, sensing and questioning. So I think the presentation by Tiffany today is really about, you know, sensing who we are, where we are, and then questioning, right? And then questioning whether there is a fractured body, whether there is a pain in your body, and then because of that feeling, that pain, then you start trying to get the answer, to find the answers, right? And that's the process of this whole collective, creative, and also writing process that ended up in a failure book project. But there is a good sign, a successful sign of the project. That's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So it's time for discussion, Q&A. I know that, you know, Tiffany's presentation might be something that is quite unusual that, you know, we have for this research day, because usually, you know, it's kind of like conventional research presentation, introduction, research question, method, and then data analysis, and then result. But, you know, it started
tried.
You tried.
I tried.
That's, you know, we really appreciate that you try to make it, you know, in that conventional structure, you know, but somehow this is really, for me, really opening up, you know, the new horizon, you know, how research can be done, can be structured, and then, you know, yeah, this is really something that, you know, refreshing. Okay. We have participants on site in this room, and we have also some participants online. So if any of you have comments or questions, please silakan jika ada pertanyaan, komentar. Boleh in bahasa Indonesia. Yeah, I will try to translate if your question is in bahasa. Yeah. Oh, pakai mic ya.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Pak Diki. I sorry for coming late. To be formed of a political psychology laboratory at the other corner from here. Okay, so it is interesting a representation thing, but I don't comprehend it. Yeah. I let me introduce myself first. I am Bonar Hutapea, one of the student of Bonar Hutapea, one of the student of doctoral student here, or PhD student in political psychology. Okay, but I am pretty interested in your presentation, especially in how we can conduct this research in terms of community psychology, but also I think also should be involve other disciplines, such as, in my opinion, maybe also a doctor, compared to my not my research, but my review on previous research on embodied trauma, but they involve doctor, because a doctor know which part of the body to the location of the embodied of the trauma. But in a presentation, I can imagine how doctor can locate it. Okay, the trauma, they said about the colonization is the first. And the second is, how can we also conduct it in the terms of humanitarian collective action? In my, I can imagine is also has connected to the humanitarian approach, since it talks about the colonization. Okay, and the third is, how about the post-colonization, post-colonial studies? Can you also think about to involve them in this research? I think this is also good for me. Thank you.
These are lots of questions. Okay, wait, what was the first one? It was where to or how to locate the trauma? Oh, involve the doctor. Oh, because the transdisciplinary question. Yeah. I've actually never thought about that angle to this. So that is a really interesting question, because I usually think, let me tell you my bias first. So my bias is thinking about the environment, right? So from a community psych standpoint, we tend to look at how is the environment shaping the individual, experiences of the individual. So I'm not thinking about the doctor, but I'm thinking about the political issues and the, it's more from this angle, right. I'm thinking about the political issues, and I'm thinking about how the political climate is actually creating the actual environment that is harming the individual. And it could be narrative, but could also be physical. It could probably be both. But in this case, this particular process is uncovering a collective way of addressing the issue. So it's trusting the individual to continue to be open to their sensing, to processing that sensing with others, and then hearing the resonances with others. They learn to trust what they're experiencing. That leads to more questioning and more sensing and trusting the senses. So the use of a doctor, I mean, in severe cases, maybe there's a physical ailment that you could actually address, right? And that might be helpful. But in this process, it was this collective resonances that validate the feeling, create the question. And it's that process. It's that constant composting. So that's how I would answer that question. But I also think, in getting to the environmental aspect of this, that there are ways to address these environmental challenges, physical challenges that are tied to these narratives, that we could be including multiple disciplines in the process. And so that would include like biological sciences and clean water systems. And, I'm just thinking about the indigenous communities I learned from in the Chiapas region in Mexico. I'm not sure if you were here for that, but we were talking about how I presented this project there, and they were like, we can figure out our own issues, but we just need clean water. And we need the corporations to stop creating these barriers in our communities so that we can continue to connect with the land, And so there's more things like that, I think, that transdisciplinary, we could be collectively working more with other disciplines to create or reduce political issues that communities are experiencing all over the world and put the power more in their hands. And so it's that empowering aspect that really would help them psychologically. I think that answers the first question. The second question was...
I mean, but also at the same time, it is in terms of ecological environmentally, but also about the decoloniality. How about we can make it an umbrella about the humanitarian approach or humanitarian collective action? Could you think about that?
Like a larger humanitarian intervention.
Yes, okay.
Well, that's sort of what I'm working on with you. So I think okay, so I'm not sure if there's a right way to answer this question, but the way that I'm interpreting it is, after learning from multiple local communities in different places, I see the same themes, see the same challenges. It's the same thing in the United States as it is in Mexico, as it is maybe even here. I don't know, right? Some of the same sort of development challenges, environmental development or ecological development, or lack of connecting to natural life systems, right? And so I think the idea that kind of working on together is this utilizing institutional, educational resources and financial resources in more sort of money heavy countries, and funneling that into places through transdisciplinary projects that can address the themes across multiple regions. And so the idea is that you build a network, all the local communities that are trying to create more regenerative systems, whether they're indigenous communities, just local groups trying to create a new democracy, or, whatever it is, but getting them together, letting them hear from each other's resonances what their common themes are, learning from those themes and those struggles. What do we need to address very tangibly in terms of clean water systems could be one, or the development of like local safety systems, right? Like housing that is not going to crumble, or systems in place that are going to help us when they do crumble, right? More sustainable local systems in general. And then also, because all of that is grounded in a political struggle, we also need the social scientists to participate, and the political scientists to assist in the struggle, the resistance of these corporate and global dynamics that are really creating the problems in the first place in many cases. And so, I don't know all the answers, right? Because I think it's embedded in the network. It's embedded in them coming together and deciding for themselves, much like we did in this smaller village, but creating this more global village that really is more aware of what's happening to each other and creating the interventions, I think, through higher education institutions, through transdisciplinary research teams. And I don't like the term research. I hate the term research, but investigations, I think, is more interesting because it's not like we don't know that capitalism is a problem. It's not like we don't know that community development systems aren't always benefiting the people that are living in these communities. We know this. So how do we address those issues? Those are the root issues. So I think it's trusting that we know that the problems are larger and then addressing those larger system challenges. That's what I would say is the humanitarian intervention. I probably could say more about that, but I'm trying not to go on and on. And then the third question was post-colonial. Can you say more about this?
Sometimes I think okay, so decoloniality means is it ongoing coloniality or imposed? Sometimes also we have also pillage, they have also coloniality in terms of capitalism. But previously, they had also experiences about the colonialism, such as Indonesian issues by Dutch colonialism and Japan at the same time. But at the same time, in terms of nowadays, they have also capitalism in terms of capitalism, is it? Mm-hmm. So how can we also consider about the two types of experiences? The post-colonial by the colonialism, but at the same time, also they have experiences about the nowadays colonialism in terms of capitalism. Which one do you think more? What is it? More experience to them. Which should do both two or only about the what you found now? Or do you have any village that also have the two experiences, two types of experiences? The colonialism and also the now the post-colonialism at the same time?
Well,
I may give you an example. In the Central Java, we have also a village that this village has experienced of previous colonialism by Dutch colonialism.
Right.
But now they stated they have experiences about new colonialism in terms of capitalism.
Right.
So they had two experiences, the
Yes.
past and the now.
It's the remnants.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And as you were talking, I was thinking neocolonialism is actually a more helpful concept because neoliberalism is the integration of capitalism as a central component of our cultural systems. So it becomes so ingrained in the way we think about the way the world works that we're unable to see our reality without the use of money. And money is you can't eat money, as another quote from an indigenous community that I was part of at some point. But, why are we using money? And so this is the reason I ended up in Mexico, actually, at their Autonomies in Practice conference, because they are creating local systems in many locations through a larger network, anti-capitalist methods, and trying to work with local organizations and businesses about how to create more bartering systems. But they do online workshops on, for example, not to buy toothpaste, not to buy Crest, because you can get the same, if not better, treatment from aloe plants in brushing your teeth. And so how have we been convinced that we need $5 to buy a tube of toothpaste that is also utilizing a number of plastics that are polluting our environment? And so, we've bought into these narratives, but it's embedded in this neo-colonial, ongoing colonialism through this integration of capitalism within our culture. And if we can imagine and learn from others about how to live in a world that isn't dependent on that capitalist system and all that's attached to it, then we could delink from that. But that is a hard sell. It's a hard sell. Yeah. Good questions.
Thank you, Pak Bonar, for the 3 questions. And oh, this is just like information.
Oh.
Anyone
You
on
don't,
Zoom?
you don't
online?
have to ask the same complexity of questions. They could be
Okay.
much more
Okay,
basic.
yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany and Pak Diki. My name is Sekar. You can easily call me Car, like 4-wheel drives.
Car.
Yeah. I'm a clinical psychologist, so this is a pretty interesting topics to know your presentation. First of all, I want to ask about the transmission of the coloniality. We know about the transgenerational trauma theory, or it's easily for me to think that the coloniality or colonial mentality is transformed through the narratives of the story, or when we look up the way of being or our parents live. But my parents also is not a generation of the colonialism. I mean, my parents probably is the 2nd generation or probably 3rd generation of the coloniality, and how the next generation like me can automatically feel the coloniality without experience it directly. Through your experience from the outside the world, you move many places. Is it a pattern that the coloniality transform to the next generation? That's my first question. And the second question is, I look up this wonderful project is to build a mental model of the community. So they have a new pattern of way of life to connect to ecology, to connect to cosmology. It's like a spiritual journey, like you said, but the problem is many people or most of us is already done with the value. Like we know that we have to be sincere, we have to be honest. But the tricky point is when we face the system. You said, you just said about the political struggle, right? We can keep our values in ourselves, but when we meet in larger area, like when you work in this project, for example, you have to face you have to face like law of the country, for example, or something that would not support this purpose of the project. So my question is, what's the next step? How can we advocate this wonderful project to strengthen mental model of the community, to make the implementation can be implemented in the reality? And then the prediction for you as the researcher is how long we can attain that future wonderful the wonderful way that people already know that we have to, that the big picture, we can fight the coloniality by starting with ourselves and strengthen our community. Hopefully it's clear enough. Thank you.
Oh yeah, there's lots of good questions in there. Oh my gosh, that was a lot. So is it possible to put the other thing up, the PowerPoint? I'm just such a visual person. I feel like I need visuals. Okay. So, okay, now I don't remember the first question, but you were talking about coloniality.
About pattern.
Wait, I'm not sure I caught that question. Actually, what was that question? Is there a pattern of coloniality?
Intergenerational.
Oh, intergenerational.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. So, okay. So interesting. I want to connect you to a resource because Vanessa Andreotti is a professor in Vancouver, Canada, who is also working on some of these kinds of projects. And she's going to be doing a talk with her daughter for this exact purpose, to figure out how to stop this intergenerational transmission of coloniality from future generations. And that's also the image of me with the woman in Chiapas. She was doing that with her son. Like, she was saying that the relationship she has with her son has to shift, and she has to disconnect or delink from the particularly the patriarchal structures of the Catholic Church in their communities, so that the relationship between the male and the son and the mother is not one of rupture, and one that the male has to resist or reject the mother. And so she thinks that there's an accompaniment in the parenting practices that needs to shift, that the dynamic needs to shift from the mother being over the child to being a more equal relationship in the growth of their co-growth, really, as mother and son, to maintain that positive connection so that the male in that relationship doesn't go on to do domestic violence to women beyond his mother. And I'm really not explaining this very well, but this is the exact issue she was addressing, this transmission of coloniality that she expected was going to happen. But her intervention was really about, I need to shift my relationship with my son so that he can respect me as a co-learner in this world. So reducing the hierarchy in that relationship. And I think in general, decoloniality is about reducing hierarchies, which this is where I feel like coloniality as a concept is really manifesting very differently in different cultural contexts, like you were suggesting, sort of what is coloniality in the midst of unique political state-run entities, right? And so, I mean, this is sort of why the precondition of a separate space where we create our own rules and norms culturally within these sort of alternative settings that we create is so important, because it's only in those spaces can you create the kind of care and empathy and all of that that's needed to create these different practices and to see that another world is possible. So that is one thing. And I think it's among the people in those spaces to really say how they're experiencing coloniality. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be here and experience coloniality. I don't know what the concept of coloniality means in this context. That would be really interesting. like how does coloniality manifest in this particular culture? I don't know. I mean, I see so many things that are very different from my context. And I think, I don't know if I could hang with this or that, but I don't know that I would perceive it as coloniality if I grew up here. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would love to know the answer to that question. So if you create an alternative community here, awesome. Okay, then another question. How long is it going to take us to get out of this? Is that what the question was? Right. So this project took 5 years for various reasons, but I think the development of our feelings of this was a fairly quick thing. I mean, I think now I'm here talking to you about this years later, but this happened in the first year. Our connection to understanding this embodied feeling of coloniality, the individual stories and how they're trying to redo their stories and create new ways of being. Like I'm only one of the group. Everyone else is doing something else. Like they're all enacting their own self-activism in different ways, based on the shifting that they've made, because the increase in consciousness of how they're tied into these colonial structures or neo-colonial structures, if you want to go there. But I think it could happen very quickly. It's like, how quickly can you start these settings? You know what I mean? And I think, we might think about it as group therapy. You could think about it like that if you want. Maybe that's the door. Maybe we walk through it as group therapy, but then you enact this process, which is really not about changing the individuals. It is about changing the individuals, but it's not only about changing the individuals, right? It's changing your consciousness about the world so that you change how you engage with reality, right? And so there is power in that. That's the idea, right? It's this constant negotiation of and awareness of our existential moment-to-moment choice to engage or not. And it's enticing to want the car and the house and the this or the that, right? That's tied into all the money. But how could we create worlds that are not tied into that? And with community, you can do that. And I joke with people all the time, I'm going to move to this location and start a village for real. Just build a hut and like live by the water and fish and create my own bowls or something. But like that sounds like utopia right now. We've talked about this. Like I just want to de-link completely from capitalism if it's possible, but it's like impossible. But also the more complicated we make things, like the more things we want. And the narratives of the world are telling us what to want, right? Media is telling us what to want. All these communications are coming at us about what to want, new technologies, new this, new that, new shoes, new whatever. And we just have to resist it, right? We have to resist it and say, I want the basics, and I want relationships that are meaningful. And I want to understand the natural environment for the spiritual entity that it is, not just a backdrop to my life, right? Anyway, sorry, I'm lecturing. But how long does it take? How quickly can we start as many of these little pods of change that we can?
Okay, Tiffany, I wonder that you said about we can work it in the level of individual for our existential understanding and also the community. But what I wonder is, what about if we face the regulation? I give you an example. For example, it's about corruption. We know that corruption is immoral.
Yeah.
But when we come into a system, we come into an institution, the system, it's not accommodate our value, to be honest, as a person. For example, when I want to say that this is the victim, I have to report to my boss. And my boss, I don't know what the system of the boss, but sometimes the boss is not supporting my decision to take this victim to the jail, for example, because we have a political attitude whatsoever. So what I wonder is the project also give the intervention to the system? So outside the individual level, outside the community level, we can also give the support to the implementation of this project through the system. Yeah. I think, I hope is clear enough for you.
I'm not sure, but I caught that sounds like utopia, but there's corruption. And then I caught the second part was, I'm not sure I caught the second part actually. I missed it. Sorry. I was trying to hold the first and then I missed the second.
Probably Pak Diki can help me. Maksudnya kita kan punya value untuk jujur, begitu ya. Tapi kalau kita ketemu, misalnya begitu ya. Tapi misalnya ini contohnya. Tapi kalau kita ketemu dengan sistem, dengan aturan, kadang-kadang itu tidak mengakomodasi nilai itu untuk terimplementasikan. Ya, misalnya kita harus laporan dulu bahwa kita bilang ini salah, tapi nggak boleh, orang ini punya latar belakang politik yang tidak bisa kita langsung katakan dia bersalah dan lain sebagainya gitu. Terima kasih.
So it's like this. We have our values, and the example is the valuing honesty, being honest. But when we get into a system or institution that sometimes requires conformity.
Kind of like this?
Yeah, something like this. That, we actually, told.
It's for good reason.
It is good to be honest. So you must be honest, but, the institution sometimes honest is not a number one priority, but there is other priority. For example, to maintain the harmony, to maintain the stability.
Now I remember your question. You were asking about how can institutions or organizations take on the system as a whole, take on this mentality?
Yeah.
So I think what you're suggesting is that institutions can increase its own awareness about the ways it enacts coloniality so that it will stop itself from perpetuating those harms, right? I mean, I think that is ultimately the idea in many ways. But I also want to suggest that we've had so many conversations about this. And this is why the alternative spaces are so important, because it's like you constantly need the alternative spaces. You constantly need something outside of the systems of capitalism because of co-optation. So the money system is never going, it's never about the majority of the people being happy or whatever you want to say is the best outcome, right? Like it feeds off of systems of inequality. That's the way that the top percent is benefiting from that system, right? We could create donut economies, more circular economies. We could, but who's invested in that? And who's not invested in that? And that's where the corruption comes in, right? And then people getting killed off or whatever happens, right? Like assassins or whatever, all kinds of things have happened historically in these cases, right? We're not the first to want to try to change the stuff, right? But I think this is why the alternative settings are so important. It's because of the co-optation, because they might take this concept and go, oh, we want to reduce our coloniality and we're going to turn it into an evaluation study and we're going to collect data about coloniality, but they're not actually changing any actual practices, right? The neo-colonial culture is going to maintain itself just under new terms, new terminologies. And so it's really this is why the analysis, the decolonial analysis of our systems is so important, is because we have to understand that as enticing as that might sound, it's like, it's hiding. It's not going to fix it. But individuals, and this is where maybe sometimes from the composting standpoint, some institutions just need to die. Some larger entities just need to fade away. And I don't know that that's going to be possible. But this is where, maybe we create alternative communities. And this is where the Chiapas community again comes into my mind, because I don't know if you've ever heard of the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas are a group in the Chiapas region. They have their own territory and they use military as a protective. And so you have them enacting the military because of corruption, because they have to protect themselves against military. And they're not in denial of that. Everyone understands that it's part of the protection of the community. But it's the only way they're able to maintain that way of life is in that alternative space and protecting it vigilantly at the front lines. I mean, I would love to learn more from them, but they have these language schools where they're teaching future generations about natural life systems, and that is a threat to these larger systems, right? But yeah, so I don't know how that answers anything. But I don't know, maybe that's where the youth come in, right? Maybe it's the youth that are going to become so aware of these systems that they're up against. And we can help them with that, right? And like, how do we help them not engage? I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. I think there is one comment or question online. Okay. Yes. I think this is from my dear friend Monica.
In Yogyakarta?
Yeah, from Yogyakarta.
Hey.
Yeah. Ya, coba dibesarkan ininya, pop out. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. She has her question in English, so you can read it. Okay, as someone who is located in the discipline of psychology, both in terms of your educational background and your current position in the university, what does it mean for you, Tiffany, to engage in the terrain of decoloniality? How has it influenced the way you look at psychology as a discipline?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Terima kasih, thank you, Monica.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the articles in the special issue is talking about the underlying ideologies of all of psychology being racist. So my faith in the practices of psychology as it's been practiced as a discipline is like gone, really, completely. And but I still believe there's an aspect of psychology that's not Western psychology or North American psychology, that is a psychology of the people, that we can create our own psychologies, and take back what that means to us in our own locales, in our own places, and with each other. And that is hope. So I think, again, the discipline of psychology is part of the colonial matrix of power that needs to be resisted, and that we need to figure out our own local psychologies. Yeah, and more, I'm just trying to figure out how to get out of academia now and how to leave the institution, but I'm not going to leave until I've utilized all higher education institutional resources to change the distribution of resources for local communities that are fighting resistance all over the world. So that is what I'm hoping to do next.
That's quite a statement. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Okay. So I try to imagine what you have done with your team. I think it's not easy. It was not easy, I think. So I don't know if you agree or not, but in my, I can imagine this is a part of, or what is this? A kind of rural participatory action research. This is quite complicated. So in terms of social intervention and community psychology, it is not easy to draw the attention the whole community, not only individual by individuals. So beyond the individuals or outside individuals, how can you and your team draw the attention of the whole communities to participate in this research and support the whole research so you can succeed in this? Okay, for us, you can share with us how we can conduct in community psychology and community participatory research. Maybe you can conduct the same, maybe quite similar in Indonesia. Thank you.
Not sure if I got that, actually. Basically, how to be more successful. I mean, I don't think that I have all the answers. I actually think I don't have any answers, honestly. I'm learning more from the Chiapas folks than I had ever imagined I would ever learn. So I think that's, I guess I see myself as a facilitator or a holder of the kinds of questions that others are asking that don't often have a voice at the tables that we're often at for various reasons. And so anyway, I guess I'm seeing myself more as a conduit in that sense. That it's not me per se that is doing anything. I mean, I in my own way am doing my own composting, my own processing of my own positionality, and how I am perpetuating coloniality in the United States, in my own apartment, in my purchases of certain technologies and foods that are pulled from all over the world, my computer and the metals that are built into it that are extracted from locations near here. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's what I can do. And I think the more I can help other people realize that we can all gain that awareness and choose whether to participate in it or not, I mean, I think that's the most important thing. And I think, you know, as being a professor in a university, I'm trying to figure out how to create the kind of pedagogy or andragogy that is going to help us increase that consciousness? And then how is that tied to action? Like, you cannot continue to live in this dissonance forever, right? So it's like every day I'm realizing another layer of the crap, another layer that needs to get broken down or delinked from. And increasingly, it's harder and harder to participate in the world, right? Because it's like, it's everywhere. That's the octopus, right? It's, you leave one and you got another one. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that we all have to do our composting and decide how we're going to enact our realities and support each other in doing different when possible. But I would love to know more about what's happening in your context around these kinds of struggles. And maybe there are groups that are trying this, and what are they coming up against? And how can we work with others around the world to sort of, how do we like see the commonalities in those struggles and then work together to find ways of addressing that? I don't know. Right? I mean, the more you know, what do you do? Yeah.
Okay. Do we have time, or it's time for closing? Maybe one, or yeah, maybe one if there is any comment or one last question. Okay.
How do you think about Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg? Are they being colonialized or something with something?
Are they part of the colonial matrix of power?
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. But yeah, it's confusing though, right? Because then you think, oh, Elon Musk, he's doing electric cars, and that's not a bad thing. But then what else is he doing? I mean, like, we are all flawed. I'm not going to just say that he's bad. Like, I'm bad too, right? Like, I do some bad things. Like, I took a plane here and used a lot of gas to get here. So, I mean, we're all kind of making those choices, how much resources we use. And I mean, he doesn't seem to be doing anything for the world. I don't know him that well either. That's the other issue. And then Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, the only thing I know about him is the Facebook stuff. See, but how is now Facebook part of the narratives? And this is the other thing, like pop culture is, and this is where I feel like, oh, now we could get into like communicative justice, right? Because if we're talking about communicative justice, this is really when you start thinking about like whose voice has power and what means of communication have power in shaping the culture of our realities. And so you've got TikTok and Instagram and Facebook is increasingly old, right? So if we're talking about affecting the youth, right, then get on TikTok, because that is where you're going to shape the thinking of what gets composted in that space. But yeah, and it's interesting when you think about Facebook, because it's like if that's an older generational space, like that there's a culture to Facebook, right? Now these online social media sites are becoming places that we participate in narrative sustainability and generation. But I think there's really a lot of hope in the TikTok world somehow right now. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. But I think right now I'm also kind of questioning these world knowledge systems. I mean, that's what the critical global ed stuff is really about. It's like it's questioning dominant communication systems and knowledge just systems that are maintaining these status quo. So if you're interested in this, I don't know, you might be interested in this, but like there's an article in a Journal of World Systems Research on the world system knowledge generation. And so just learning more about how academic capital particularly is part of this process. And if you look at the flow of these systems, it actually aligns with economic and other kind of dominant flows. So if we're only publishing in top tier journals or Scopus journals that are part of that flow of information, You know, we got to be careful what we're putting in those flows. How are we shaping narratives by what we're doing there? And then being more critical maybe in how we utilize those means of communication, or more strategic at least. And then if we want to shape culture, get on TikTok, right? Or get on the YouTube videos, create a YouTube channel. I mean, there's a guy I follow him. His name is, oh gosh, I'm blanking on it now. I totally right. The Transcontinental Social Research Institute, I think is what it's called. VJ is his name. You know VJ. Okay, yeah, VJ. I think he's located in India. But anyway, he's got all kinds of material that is shaping things. So, I mean, tapping into the people that you can kind of share widely that are pushing back on these existing systems. I think that's another way to shape narratives. I don't know. I went off on a tangent. Sorry.
Okay, I think that's the last questions. So thank you everyone online and also offline who participated in this very interesting talk and presentation. Quite unusual for us here at this particular Faculty of Psychology. Yeah, I think earlier I mentioned about sensing, questioning, and then I think later on we are thinking and I think more familiar with, you know, as you said, composting, yeah, and then basically then a building network, right? I think that's the key takeaways from this talk, from this presentation: sensing, questioning, composting, and then building a network. So I think that's all. Thank you, Tiffany, for sharing with us. Yeah, yeah. This is really interesting talk, and yeah, thank you everyone who joined this presentation. We'll see you again in upcoming Research Day next month. Thank you. Selamat siang. Good afternoon, everyone. Bye.